Mark Twain Selected Works, Autobiographical Dictation of March 30th, 1906. Helen Keller. The prior engagement which I spoke of to Tchaikovsky was an engagement to act as chairman at the first meeting of the association which was formed 5 months ago in the interest of the adult blind. Joseph H. Choate and I had a very good time there, and I came away with the conviction that excellent enterprise is going to flourish and will bear abundant fruit. It will do for the adult blind what Congress and the several legislatures do so faithfully and with such enthusiasm for our lawless railway corporations, our rotten beef trusts, our vast robber dens of insurance magnates, in a word, for each and all of our multimillionaires and their industries. Protect them, take watchful care of them, preserve them from harm like a providence, and secure their prosperity and increase it. The state of New York contains 6,000 listed blind persons and also 1,000 or so who have not been searched out and listed. There are between 300 and 400 blind children. The state confines its benevolence to these. It confers upon them a book education. It teaches them to read and write. It feeds them and shelters them, and, of course, it pauperizes them because it furnishes them no way of earning a living for themselves. The state's conduct toward the adult blind, and this conduct is imitated by the legislatures of most of the other states, is purely infamous. Outside of the blind asylums, the adult blind person has a hard time. He lives merely by the charity of the compassionate when he has no relatives able to support him, and now and then, as a benevolence, the state stretches out its charitable hand and lifts him over to Blackwell's Island and submerges him among that multitudinous population of thieves and prostitutes. But in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, and in 2 or 3 other states, associations like this new one we have formed have been at work for some years, supported entirely by private subscriptions, and the benefits conferred and the work accomplished are so fine and great that their official reports read like a fairy tale. It seems almost proven that there are not so very many things accomplishable by persons gifted with sight which a blind person cannot learn to do and do as well as that other person. Helen Keller was to have been present last night, but she is ill in bed and has been ill in bed during several weeks through overwork in the interest of the blind, the deaf, and the dumb. I need not go into any particulars about Helen Keller. She is fellow to Caesar, Alexander, Napoleon, Homer, Shakespeare, and the rest of the immortals. She will be as famous 1,000 years from now as she is today. I remember the first time I ever had the privilege of seeing her. She was 14 years old then. She was to be at Lawrence Hutton's house on a Sunday afternoon, and 12 or 15 men and women had been invited to come and see her. Henry Rogers and I went together. The company had all assembled and had been waiting a while. The wonderful child arrived now, with her about equally wonderful teacher, Miss Sullivan. The girl began to deliver happy ejaculations in her broken speech, without touching anything, and without seeing anything, of course, and without hearing anything. She seemed to quite well recognize the character of her surroundings. She said, "Oh, the books, so many books. How lovely." The guests were brought one after another and introduced to her. As she shook hands with each, she took her hand away and laid her fingers lightly against Miss Sullivan's lips, who spoke against them the person's name. When a name was difficult, Miss Sullivan not only spoke it against Helen's fingers, but spelled it upon Helen's hand with her own fingers. Stenographically, apparently, for the swiftness of the operation was suggestive of that. Mr. Howells seated himself by Helen on the sofa, and she put her fingers against his lips, and he told her a story of considerable length, and you could see each detail of it pass into her mind and strike fire there and throw the flash of it into her face. Then I told her a long story, which she interrupted all along and in the right places with cackles, chuckles, and carefree bursts of laughter. Then Miss Sullivan put one of Helen's hands against her lips and spoke against it the question, "What is Mr. Clemens distinguished for?" Helen answered in her crippled speech, "For his humor." I spoke up modestly and said, "And for his wisdom." Helen said the same words instantly, "And for his wisdom." I suppose it was a case of mental telegraphy, since there was no way for her to know what it was I had said. After a couple of hours spent very pleasantly, someone asked if Helen would remember the feel of the hands of the company after this considerable interval of time, and be able to discriminate the hands and name the possessors of them. Miss Sullivan said, "Oh, she will have no difficulty about that." So the company filed past, shook hands in turn, and with each handshake Helen greeted the owner of the hand pleasantly and spoke the name that had belonged to it without hesitation until she encountered Mr. Rogers toward the end of the procession. She shook hands with him, then paused, and a reflectant expression came into her face. Then she said, "I'm glad to meet you now. I have not met you before." Miss Sullivan told her she was mistaken. This gentleman was introduced to her when she first arrived in the room. But Helen was not affected by that. She said no, she never had met this gentleman before. Then Mr. Rogers said that perhaps the confusion might be explained by the fact that he had his glove on when he was introduced to Helen. Of course, that explained the matter. This was not in the afternoon, as I have misstated. It was in the forenoon, and by the assemblage proceeded to the dining room and sat down to the luncheon. I had to go away before it was over, and as I passed by Helen, I patted her lightly on the head and passed on. Miss Sullivan called me and said, "Stop, Mr. Clemens. Helen is distressed because she did not recognize your hand. Won't you come back and do that again?" I went back and patted her lightly on the head, and she said at once, "Oh, it's Mr. Clemens." Perhaps someone can explain this miracle, but I have never been able to do it. Could she feel the wrinkles in my hand through her hair? Someone else must answer this. I am not competent.